Of the three Knabenphysik, born in the first years of the 20th century, he was by far the most idiosyncratic, and probably closest to that stereotype of an inwardly focused scientist who works in isolation to achieve results barely understood by his contemporaries, much less those outside his field of research. Yet even in this characterization, we find a man with goals and ambitions who worked with the greatest physical minds of his time to lay the foundation of how we understand matter. While certainly an introvert, he nevertheless communicated with and shared ideas among the likes of Heisenberg, Pauli, Oppenheimer, and Bohr, whom he admired above all. His physics is the stuff of high mathematics, an elegant but often impenetrable theory. Like Pauli and Heisenberg, he contributed to every single advance in quantum theory after 1925 as part of the Munich, Göttingen, Copenhagen triangle of research institutes, even as he hailed from Cambridge in England. In time, his brilliance and contributions would be recognized by an appointment to the very academic position that had once been occupied by Sir Isaac Newton.
Hello, and welcome to the Scientific Odyssey. The Scientific Odyssey is a many-part journey into the history and philosophy of science. My name is Chad Davies, and I'm the writer, host, and producer of the podcast, where we consider the ideas, processes, and results of over 2,500 years of scientific inquiry and discovery.
Series 2, A History of the Atom. Episode 17.1, Supplemental. Paul Dirac, the Mathematician. Paul Adrien Maurice Dirac was born in Bristol, England on Friday, August 8, 1902. His father, Charles Dirac, was a Swiss national who had emigrated to England to teach foreign languages. Gifted as an educator, Charles found quick employment in a local school and soon had a number of private students for tutoring. In 1900, Charles met Florence Holton, and in due course, a marriage took place and children soon followed. Paul was the middle child of the family, with an ill-fated older brother and a younger sister who never amounted to much. Paul, however, would go on to rise from these humble roots and take his place among the scientific titans. Now, before I go much further, I should say a few things about the various biographical sketches of Paul Dirac that I have read. My main source for this episode is Graham Farmello's biography, The Strangest Man, The Hidden Life of Paul Dirac, Mystic of the Atom. The title comes from a quote from Niels Bohr, who claimed that Dirac was, quote, the strangest man, unquote, who had ever visited his institute. This illustrates one of the most aggravating things related to learning about Dirac that I have come across. The sheer oddness of the man leads to more stories about the strange things he did or said than about his work. This is taken to a bit of an extreme in George Gamow's book, The 30 Years That Shook Physics, where the chapter discussing Dirac is almost completely devoid of descriptions of the physics he did, while being filled with accounts of his very short conversations or almost matter-of-fact questions. Farmello's biography has a nice break from this, as it spends a significant amount of time on the science while placing the stories in a much better context, thus rendering them less otherworldly. Moreover, Farmello does a good job of weaving in Dirac's personal life, religious thoughts, and political opinions in such a way that we gain a much more complete picture than anything I've been able to find in accounts of the development of quantum theory or through internet sources. While I certainly don't wish to avoid these stories, as they do make up a part of the man's life, and they offer insight into the workings of his mind, they can end up reducing him to a caricature. What I hope to do is try to explain to you, my listener, what factors in his upbringing contributed to his unique way of interacting with the world around him and his method of approaching physical problems. The first place to start, then, is with his father. The picture of Charles Dirac one forms depends much on the sources that are used to document his life. To his colleagues and students, Charles was a rigorous but fair instructor who expected excellent work of his charges, but who also went to some lengths to support and encourage that level of achievement. He was a diligent man with a strong work ethic who was conscientious almost to a fault. To Paul, however, Charles Dirac was little more than an autocratic martinet, a tenpenny home dictator who little valued his wife and terrorized his children. He spoke only French in his home and insisted his family do the same when addressing him. This would lead Paul to say that until he went off to school, he thought all parents spoke different languages, which sort of puts the whole men are from Mars, women are from Venus thing in perspective, you know? The most common story related about this period is that of the mealtime routine. Charles insisted that if his family wished to share his table, they must be sufficiently fluent in French. Unfortunately for Paul, he was the only one of the family who met his father's standard, and so he was the only member of the household who, quote-unquote, got, which you should read had, to eat with Charles. As Charles insisted that all conversation take place in French, and, moreover, ideas be expressed reasonably clearly, Paul found that he struggled to form his thoughts clearly enough to say anything that wouldn't be immediately criticized and corrected. Rather than trying to speak and thus risk his father's scorn or censure, Paul quickly learned to keep his thoughts to himself and to speak with a parsimony that would become a hallmark of his personal spoken communication thereafter. I mean, think of this experience from a kid's point of view. Let's say he wants to put a little butter on his mashed potatoes at dinner. In order to ask for that butter, he has to make sure that he can make the entire request in grammatically proper French, or Dad's going to jump down his throat and then probably lecture him. He either practices the request multiple times in his head, or just decides it's not worth the trouble and has his mash plain. The results of this upbringing are readily apparent in the way Dirac speaks to others for the rest of his life, especially if the situation is socially fraught or the person is not well known. As with many things about Dirac, this tendency is best illustrated with yet another story. In his 20s, Dirac would be a postdoctoral fellowship student working with Bohr. While he admired the older man's way of thinking and working, he was amazed at Bohr's constant revising and qualifying of thoughts, often done right in the middle of a sentence. As Dirac would later reflect on his time with Bohr, he said about himself, "I never started a sentence I didn't know how to finish," something he undoubtedly developed at the dinner table in his home as a boy. Bohr's habit of stopping in the middle of one thing to revise a word perplexed and frustrated Dirac to no end. For most of his life, when in groups of people, Dirac would rarely answer a question outside of physics with more than a yes or a no. Often, when he was pressed to offer an opinion or express a desire, he would simply say, "I have no preference." In his early schooling, Paul was a solid, if somewhat unexceptional student, until the headmaster at his school scolded him for not working to his potential. This expression of disappointment spurred the young Dirac to apply himself a good bit more diligently, and very soon he was not only at the head of his class, but outperforming those students in the grades ahead of him, including his older brother Felix. As the two got older, Paul following Felix through the grades, this disparity would create a tension that would contribute to a significant rupture in their relationship during college, one that would never heal. As part of the educational curriculum in England during this time, there was a focus on students learning a certain set of technical skills. These skills were taught as part of an effort to keep England competitive in the increasingly technical and global marketplace. With the United States and Germany quickly industrializing, there was a growing threat to Britain's place as the manufacturing leader in the world. Then, as now, there was a desire to infuse the curriculum with topics that related to tasks professionals in the fields of manufacturing and engineering would need, even at a very young age. One of these topics was learning to draw what are known as orthogonal projections, something I'm sure the engineers in the listening audience can appreciate. These are drawings of a simple object from three different perspectives, each at right angles from the others, something that any well-trained draftsman would be able to do, and now usually supplied by CAD programs. While Dirac did these drawings competently, if not spectacularly, the practice of creating them would have had a profound impact on his scientific work throughout his life. Combined with the Euclidean geometry he was learning at about the same time, the task of imagining how points would translate in space when viewed from different perspectives would teach him to visualize the spatial relationships a mathematical relationship would encompass. One final thing Dirac would learn during this time was to emulate the industry and work ethic of his father. As I mentioned before, Charles Dirac was an extraordinarily conscientious man, extremely devoted to his work. Paul's mother would say in an interview later in his life, quote, "His father's motto was always been to work, work, work. And if the boy had shown any other tendencies, then they would have been stifled. But that was not necessary. The boy was not interested in anything else." In time, Paul's studies led him to complete his junior school training, what we might call grades 1 through 6, and enroll in senior school. Somewhat unfortunately for he and his brother, the schooling would be undertaken at a school where his father taught, something that increased Paul's sense of being trapped under the thumb of the older man. As he was preparing to start in 1914, England entered World War I. As Bristol was an industrial town and served as the center of Britain's emerging aviation industry, Dirac would have seen many signs of wartime activity. Additionally, as part of the country's program to reduce disease, especially tuberculosis, an effort which had begun not long after Paul was born, there was an ongoing push to make sure young school-age boys got enough fresh air. In light of this, Charles decided not to pay the bus fare for his boys to travel to and from school, thus forcing them to walk. While they hated having to do it at the time, it is likely that this twice-daily routine of walking to and from school caused Paul to develop his daily practice later in life, of solitary walks during which he would think about physics away from the hustle and bustle of whatever office he might be working in. At the school, generally regarded as the best in England in terms of technical education, Dirac excelled in almost every topic he studied. He continued to expand his abilities in technical drawing with a greater emphasis on incorporating geometrical thinking into his work. This was extended to thinking about objects in motion. For example, conceptualizing the path through space a point on a circle would take if the circle were to roll along the ground in a straight line. These exercises would have honed his ability to visualize abstract mathematical ideas as well as delighted his imagination. He also learned basic machining skills, something not usually part of the education of a burgeoning scientific mind. As part of the scientific curriculum, he took chemistry, a subject recently energized by the work of Ernest Rutherford, as well as some rudimentary physics. Given his prodigious intellectual talent, Dirac quickly mastered these subjects, often doing in short order homework that other students took much longer to do. The extra time this afforded him gave him the chance to think about the connections between space and time, something he seems to have done even before learning of Einstein's work. As was the case with Heisenberg, the war had a rather macabre silver lining. As more boys left the school to join the military effort, there were spots that opened up for young men who wanted to move faster in order to fill those higher classes that were now empty. Dirac was able to finish his senior school education at just age 16, right as the war was coming to an end. Probably the best way to imagine him at this time would be to draw a mental picture. His mother insisted on dressing him in out-of-fashion knickerbockers and tightly curling his hair. He was socially awkward and detested playing team sports. He was obviously brilliant and given over to technical subjects with little interest in literature, with the exception of the confiscated comic books his schoolteacher father would bring home from time to time. He preferred to spend time in the library or in the garden in solitary pursuits. He never spoke to his classmates, even as he eclipsed them in nearly every subject. In other words, as Farmello so aptly puts it, Dirac was an Edwardian geek. If only he'd known about steampunk. Upon finishing senior school, Dirac enrolled in college to study engineering. The particular college in Bristol was an extension of the highly regarded senior school, and the engineering program had a strong emphasis on the practical application side of things with less of a focus on theory. As such, while Dirac excelled in theoretical subjects, he struggled in areas of application and implementation, considered to be the nuts and bolts of the degree. While he finished the entire mathematics portion of the curriculum within his first year, he struggled to master the laboratory exercises, often only persevering with the help of his first friend that he had ever made in school. When not in class, the fairly penniless young Dirac would be found in the college's library studying physics and amusing himself with word searches in German. This rather boring routine would be completely changed in 1919 when it was announced that English astrophysicist Arthur Eddington had confirmed Einstein's general theory of relativity. While Eddington's work was part of a larger project, wherein a number of teams provided the needed observational evidence to provide experimental confirmation of the predictions of the theory, Eddington's excellent communication style, particularly in conveying the ideas of Einstein through easily understandable explanations, quickly brought him acclaim and made his observations famous. Nearly 1 year after Armistice Day, the Times of London ran a 900-word article on a page 12 titled "A Revolution in Science." While the article seemed to have been buried behind coverage of the upcoming plans to mark the anniversary, it catapulted both Einstein and Eddington to fame. It also caught the attention of the students at the college, most notably Dirac. While most of the popular accounts of the theory were horribly misleading due to a lack of good science journalism at the time, Eddington took pains to write understandable and engaging articles that explained some of the easier-to-grasp ideas and concepts in terms that the general reader can understand. Unfortunately for Dirac, most of what he could get his hands on lacked much mathematical rigor, and he struggled to make sense of the inner logic of Einstein's ideas. Part of this was due to being sent off to an internship in Rugby. Working in a factory there, the 18-year-old Dirac found out very quickly that the life of an applied engineer might not be for him. From the summer's work, he received the only poor performance marks of his entire life, with his work being called slovenly and him being labeled as a menace in the electrical testing department. It seems as if it wasn't just Polly, whose very presence seemed to initiate equipment malfunction. Upon returning to Bristol for his final year of engineering education, Dirac decided to make his focus electrical engineering, due to the higher amount of theoretical content in that subject at the time. The high point of the year was a series of lectures on relativity given by the English philosopher Charles Broad at the college. While Broad was a rather poor lecturer, Dirac drank in the content in a way his fellow engineering students could not. For Dirac, there were two results of attending these lectures. The first was to take upon himself sort of a new geeky hobby, revitalizing, or relativizing, I should say, classical mechanics. One of the principles of Einstein's theory was that it took the standard Newtonian theory and made corrections to it based on a small number of fundamental assumptions about nature. Upon hearing about this, Dirac took up the task of whenever he encountered some small piece of classical theory to determine and apply the necessary relativistic corrections. The second and more important outcome was a change in his conceptualization of space and time. In classical physics, space and time are completely separate things. As such, something like the Pythagorean theorem had the form of adding the squares of the sides of the triangle to get the square of the triangle's hypotenuse, something you probably heard about in an algebra class or geometry class in high school. In the theory of relativity, because time was treated as just another spatial variable, it turns out that due to the way this is incorporated, the way in which the hypotenuse of the triangle in space-time is calculated changes. Now, the way the change happens is that the square of the time-based spatial coordinate is now subtracted instead of added when calculating that hypotenuse. While the details of this are probably beyond the scope of the podcast, the recognition of this change fundamentally altered Dirac's perception of space-time. In this example, he realized that he'd been thinking about the ideas of space and time completely incorrectly, and set himself to the task of reorienting his thinking in the more physically and geometrically correct way found in Einstein's theory, something aided, no doubt, by the years of spatial visualization he had done in producing technical diagrams. Working from the lectures, as well as from Eddington's semi-rigorous popular account of relativity, Dirac was able to work out the equations of both special and general relativity during his senior year of college in 1920. It should be noted he did this without looking at Einstein's papers introducing either of the topics. Moreover, taking the course from a philosopher convinced him of the need to engage in more study of philosophy and science, and soon he embarked in reading John Stuart Mill's work, System of Logic. Mill had been deeply influenced by Auguste Comte's writings on the centrality of empiricism that would become the basis of the positivism movement in the middle and late 1800s. Mill's thoughts on science and how science progresses in developing accurate descriptions of nature would strongly inform Dirac's thinking and work throughout his career. Dirac graduated from college in July of that year with first-class honors. And while he did stand for and brilliantly passed the entrance exams for graduate study at Cambridge, he was short of the money needed to attend. Unfortunately, Dirac graduated right into Britain's devastating post-war recession and was unable to find work. It was then that one of the mathematics professors at his former school suggested he come and take courses for free in the math department rather than idling his time away. Dirac took him up on the offer, and while he occasionally had to stand at the back of the line for various services, he excelled in the program. In his first year, he studied pure mathematics and learned an obscure branch of the subject known as Projective Geometry that taught a person how to solve complex problems through the use of geometric ideas and projections rather than by using convoluted algebraic manipulation. This would serve Dirac in good stead in the coming years, as he struggled to conceptualize the highly mathematical physics he was doing in order to understand what was actually taking place in the atom. In his final year of mathematical study, Dirac ended up studying applied mathematics, which included a good deal of physics. In addition to the typical work in Newtonian and the introduction to Maxwellian physics, he studied the reformulation of Newton's classical dynamics by William Hamilton. Hamilton had figured out how to rewrite all of Newton's ideas in terms of momentum and energy in a way that was profoundly elegant. Hamilton had also invented a mathematical object known as quaternions. These mathematical constructs were interesting on a number of accounts, but, for the purposes of our narrative, the most interesting thing is that they were non-commutative. In other words, the order in which one performed operations like addition or multiplication on them actually mattered. If you've been following along with the podcast, you know that this is an idea that's going to become very important a year or two hence. During his time as a mathematics student, Dirac also took a number of courses from the physics department. It was here that he was introduced to the ideas we've been discussing in the podcast, including the work of Thomson and Rutherford at Cambridge and Bohr's work on atomic theory in Copenhagen. Due to the messy state of the field in 1922 and 1923, however, Dirac did not see the mathematical elegance and clarity that he normally found so engaging, and so his primary interest in the area of physics remained with relativity. Upon receiving his second degree with first honors, Dirac was once again recommended for study at Cambridge and was able to find enough scholarship money this time around to afford the tuition and living expenses. He planned to study with one of Eddington's colleagues, but when he found out that the man was no longer taking students due to having been pilloried for being a conscientious objector during the Great War, Dirac ended up being assigned to the mathematician and quantum theorist Ralph Fowler. Fowler turned out to be an excellent mentor to Dirac. While many students wanted a graduate advisor who was very hands-on, Dirac was content to have someone who could offer challenging problems to push him, had an insightful mind that could keep up with his work, and a hands-off approach that gave him space in which to think. Over the course of the next 18 months, Dirac would, with some pointed goading from Fowler, publish 5 solid, though not earth-shaking papers that established him at Cambridge as one of the best graduate students in the college. His college, by the way, was St. John's. Still, Dirac knew that he was really just getting warmed up. While the problems he attacked were certainly worthy of consideration, they didn't really test his powers of insight, and so he found himself waiting for something a bit more substantial to work on. As Fowler was often absent from Cambridge in order to attend meetings and conferences related to quantum theory on the continent, Dirac was both allowed his desired space to think while benefiting from the most up-to-date information on the work being done both in the fields of relativity and atomic physics. Moreover, with Fowler's connections to the research centers in Germany, he was able to bring the foremost researchers and students to lecture on subjects at Cambridge. Just was such a case when Verner Heisenberg was invited to lecture on quantum theory. As part of the lecture series, he gave a copy of the proofs of his latest paper to Fowler to review. Fowler was very busy and a bit perplexed by the odd mathematics in the paper, which seemed to detail a new calculation technique for determining transitions in the atom. He passed the paper on to Dirac for additional review to see if his brightest student could make heads or tails of it. The rest, as they say, is history. As I've covered much of this material in early episodes, let me summarize here. The paper was, of course, Heisenberg's 1925 paper laying out matrix mechanics. Dirac, initially dismissing the paper as being of, quote, no interest, returned to it some 10 days later after he'd had time to mull over the strange matrix mathematics Heisenberg had used. What had jumped out at him was Heisenberg's recognition that the position and momentum were no longer commutative quantities in this formulation of quantum theory. While Heisenberg had never encountered such a thing before, Dirac's extensive training in mathematics had shown him several such cases in the arcana of the subject. After working with Heisenberg's theory for a time and reporting back to Fowler, he set it aside. Then, as the leaves of Cambridge began to turn, he was out for a customary Sunday walk when he realized in a flash what Heisenberg's P times Q minus Q times P represented. Having to wait until Monday morning to check out his hunch, he determined that the relationship was part of a class of entities known as Poisson brackets. From this understanding, Dirac was able to, with a couple of weeks of work, write a significant paper laying out a generalized formalism of Heisenberg's initial paper. When Dirac showed Fowler the work, the older man immediately recognized its significance and rushed the paper to publication in order to ensure Dirac's priority of results. In Göttingen, Bohr and Jordan had produced similar results at roughly the same time, but had not hurried to publish. When Dirac's paper arrived at their institute, it was like a bolt of lightning out of the blue. No one had had any idea who he was, or that there was someone in Cambridge even working on the same problems as being worked on in Göttingen. Bohr would later write in his memoirs that reading Dirac's paper was, quote, one of the greatest surprises of my life. The author appeared to be a youngster, yet everything was perfect in its way and admirable. Unquote. Dirac's paper was also a great surprise to Heisenberg, who was working with Bohr and Jordan on 2 follow-up papers of his own that would further expand and extend the mathematics, much in the fashion of Dirac's work. In a letter sent in response to its receipt, Heisenberg wrote that he had read Dirac's, quote, beautiful work with great interest, unquote, adding that, quote, there can be no doubt that all your results are correct insofar as one believes in the new theory, unquote. This 2-page letter would begin a friendship between the two men that would last 50 years and take them around the world to spread together the gospel of quantum theory. It is at this point that we must suspend the narrative for a time. The episode is already a bit longer than I'd like, and there's still a great deal to cover. In the next podcast, we'll go over what may be the most amazing 8-year run of productive work ever done by any physicist. We'll also take a bit of time to examine the man's personal views on politics and religion, and learn that even someone as odd as Dirac could fall in love, and perhaps even more surprisingly, find someone to fall in love with him. As always, thanks for listening, and if you have a moment, leave a review on whatever service you're using to listen to this on. For those of you for whom this is your first exposure to the podcast, I just want to let you know iTunes is doing this weird thing where it's only listing the 20 most recent episodes. If you like what you hear, be sure to subscribe to us there, and you'll get all 30-something of my previous narratives, including my introduction to scientific inquiry. It's a lot of fun, at least if you consider yourself a true Edwardian geek like Dirac. Anyways, thanks again, and until next time, full sails on your journey.